Please note that this episode contains content relating to depression and suicide that some people may find disturbing. If you or anyone you know is struggling with mental health, the number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. Collegiate rowers reap enormous benefits from participating in sport. They're more healthy, physically fit, traditionally more supported by their college campuses through tutoring and other services than their non-athlete counterparts. They walk onto campus with a strong built-in community of like-minded peers, driven, hardworking, active, with a desire to pursue excellence both on the water and off. Many collegiate athletes also benefit from athletic scholarships that make school affordable for them and their families. But there are unique challenges to being a collegiate athlete. The time commitment is substantial, with multiple practice sessions a day and constant pressure to perform while balancing a full course load. Also, collegiate rowers' identities become inextricably linked to the sport. If they face an injury or illness, they are removed from the boat and the tight-knit community, feeling they no longer add value, and this can be difficult to navigate. Athletes have spent most of their lives being rewarded for their stoicism and strength, for pushing through discomfort. In a critical way, this predisposes the most successful athletes to be at a higher risk for not getting the care they need if mental health issues arise. It's important to share some broader context here. These statistics won't be a surprise to anyone who is spending time with teenagers as a caregiver, teacher, or coach. A recent federal study shows that teenagers as a group are struggling in this country. In 2019, 13% of adolescents reported having a major depressive episode, a 60% increase from 2007. We hope this podcast will help coaches, athletes, parents of athletes to have these important conversations on this topic. Today, I'm speaking with Brenda Lilly, the mother of a young rower, Brian Lilly Jr., from UC San Diego. Brian died by suicide at the age of 19 in January of 2021. This tragedy in the Lilly's family brought Brenda and I together in the fall of 2021 when we began discussing athlete mental health and well-being. Today's conversation is an effort to share Brian's story in the hopes of bringing some guidance and resources to collegiate athletes and the parents, coaches, and teammates who surround them. I'm deeply grateful to Brenda for taking the time with us today. Hi, Brenda. Welcome.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Well, it's so nice to actually see you. I know we've spoken on the phone and I've never been able to see your face, so this is a treat. Thank you.
I know. Great to see you too.
You know, Brenda, I'm going to just jump right in and ask you if you can tell us about Brian. I know he was a rower at UC San Diego, your son, an older brother to his sister, Virginia. But tell us more. How did he get into rowing?
Well, he got into rowing his sophomore year of high school in the spring with Pelham Community Rowing Association, PCRA, in Pelham, New York. The year before, in going into freshman year, he got a new bike. He joined the gym. You could join New York Sport if you were 14, and he joined, and he really never looked back. He had struggled with his weight through middle school from juvenile arthritis, and he was really committed at that point, headed into high school, to make a lot of change. So that began his fitness journey. And I would say wellness journey. You know, he really changed his diet. He changed how he ate, how much he slept. He started getting a lot more sleep at night. And it really was discovering rowing in sophomore year. So in the spring, he loved it because he did not have to run to be able to go fast. And running was always a challenge for him because of JRA. So it was a great way to be able to participate in sports and not have to run. So it was a lot to learn in the beginning. You know, it was wasn't pretty at first.
It never
and
is.
No. And by that time, he was, he was 6'4". I guess at that point when he started, he was probably 6'3". But his coach, Reed Johnson, said Brian was all arms and legs in the beginning. He was like a big praying mantis in the water and, all over the place. But he was really determined, and he started to learn more about technique and getting more control, and learned from some great coaches, and was very motivated with his teammates to learn more. And he just got better and better. And then in junior year, he was awarded the most improved on the boys team. And then he was truly honored to become the team captain in his senior year.
Wow. Okay. And then he clearly went on to row in college.
Right. So before college, in the fall of his senior year, after he finished the rowing season, he ran the New York City Marathon. So he did that in November. And then he was accepted to UCSD for rowing in the spring. And then in the summer, between senior year of high school and freshman year of college, he finished in the Ironman triathlon in Lake Placid, New York. So he was just pumped, he was really, really excited he just adored competing and adored getting better and better. And it was super motivated. Right. So he went on to start that fall of 2019 rowing at UCSD as a freshman. And he loved it. He did start to have mental health challenges for the first time in his life in late fall of 2019 and into spring of 2020. Like most college kids in March of 2020, he came back to New York. So many schools were closing and kids were coming home. And he did that. He came back to New York, and he due to COVID. And then he successfully finished the spring semester online with UCSD, getting A's and B's. And it was really just, excessive stress, isolation that he was enduring, and that so many students, student athletes were dealing with. He was particularly affected, and like so many people, he started self-medicating to manage being away from everything that he identified with, right? Being away from campus, his friends, being able to go to class, and rowing. He really, really missed rowing.
Yeah, when that community was taken away from so many young people in college and in high school, so many sports and communities for young people, it was truly a very hard situation for so many young people. Right. He was not alone in that. So moving through that, I was reading about on the Mayo Clinic's website, they talk a lot about, what are the signs of mental health distress? And it's not a short list, right? Persistent sadness, withdrawing from social interactions, talking about hurting oneself, outbursts or extreme irritability, changes in sleep, eating, and moods, again, not a short list. And at the same time, we keep reading or we know about these athletes in college who seem to be at the top of the world. They're strong students, they're talented athletes, they're well liked by their peers, they have social circles, they're seemingly happy. And then when they tragically die by suicide, people are so often left wondering how they missed the signs. But there weren't any signs. Certainly not, clear signs. So did anyone see this with Brian, and tied to that, how can we do more when we don't have those signs?
Well, I will say this, by the time we got to summer of 2020, right? So he had finished classes in the spring and it was not easy. And some of the signs that you're talking about were there, things like troubles at that. He was always a great sleeper and he was very committed to sleep. He would leave his phone downstairs. He did not take his phone even upstairs to his room when he went to bed at night. He just turned off. But he was having trouble sleeping. There was some irritability, and I would say mood swings and things like that. So there were some signs of that, but I will also say, especially with COVID and with that isolation, a lot of adults were absolutely dealing with that, and younger children as well. So, and in terms of other signs, as we got into the summer of that year, and I will also point out in the spring of that year, it was also very, very difficult to get mental health care.
Yes.
So therapists were overwhelmed, psychiatrists, psychologists were overwhelmed. And we were at that point seeking some therapy, right? So I was calling everyone and anyone, and either therapists were just not seeing patients, or they had wait lists of months, literally months. So I know that we were not alone in that, and that many people were dealing with just all of a sudden at the time when we needed it the most, mental health care in our country seemed, and throughout the world, just seemed to sort of freeze and dry up. And as it got into summer, it became very obvious that Brian needed help, and he wanted help. So we were talking about it, and it was particularly one weekend of saying, okay, we're gonna get you help. So he did get inpatient mental health care in a hospital. He had psychiatric care for 3 weeks at that time over that summer. He then after that did another 5 weeks of what's called IOP, intensive outpatient care. And at that point it was online on Zoom, but he was very committed to acknowledging where he was struggling, and also addressing the issues, getting coping skills, understanding triggers that could bring on sadness. I also want to say he was substance free. He was not using any substances at all at that point. He was living at home with our family. So we were all there together. And then in the fall of 2020, he opted out of rowing to focus on mental health and his studies. He did school online like so many other kids that fall. Studying real estate and philosophy, and got A's and B's in his classes again, did well. He was engaged, and he was actively working with a therapist and a psychiatrist consistently through the fall. So while there were signs there early on, he was also really kind of like so many other things that he had done in his life, really wanted to tackle it head on. And he was actively working hard on being healthy.
It sounds like he was a very smart young man to recognize, that he needed help, and to be able to express that, and to be in a family that could provide that, and was ready to provide that support. I hear a lot from people about how athletes are, they're more predisposed to try to grin and bear it, to try to, not complain, to work through the discomfort, which can serve them very well as athletes, but then can be a disservice when it comes to needing help, and needing to sort of wave the flag and say, wait a minute, I'm not okay.
Right.
But you think with Brian, that was not really an issue.
Right. Certainly at that point, it wasn't. I mean, everything was on the table for us. Everything was on the table for him. He was very, very open. And as he got into the fall, and he also began training again, even at home. He was erging. We had an erg in the garage, which he was doing consistently. He was biking, which he loved to do. He was running, and he was really getting back to a great place, and was in a really strong place when he started talking about going back to school in the spring, and that he really deeply wanted to be back at school.
Yeah, with his, I imagine, with his teammates and with the sport. And then tied to that piece, what do you think the role is or should be of coaches and assistant coaches and school administrators? You know, they have this big job to do, which is coach the young people in the sport. But they have such consistent access to the athletes. So that's sort of a unique point of contact. And what do you think the role should be there?
Well, we know that people get motivation from a couple of different places, right? But it often kind of stems back to either fear, which can be a motivator, or interest. And just like other professionals, some coaches use short-term tools like fear to motivate, and it can make someone row faster. It can in the short term. But we believe that and as do so many, and there's so many fantastic coaches out there, and certainly Brian had a lot of them in high school. But we know that the long game of coaching is showing up and telling the athletes that you genuinely care about them, and working towards their interests, showing them that you are interested in them and that you want to help set them up for success, showing them through many different touch points of how you care, and cultivating that mutual trust with them. We don't expect coaches to be psychologists or therapists. That's certainly not their role. But between the long-term social effects from COVID and isolation, and also the influences of social media today on everyone, including student athletes, it's just a very different training and school life environment than it was even 1 or 2 years ago, right? The athletes, these young adults, they're not soft. Life has changed dramatically for them, just like it has for all of us. And we know that U.S. Rowing and Safe Sport and colleges and universities are committed to giving resources to club coaches, to university coaches, to help support athlete mental health.
Yeah, I was talking to Steve Pritzker. He's an assistant athletic director at UVA and was a collegiate rower and collegiate coach, and he commented on just how he wished that there were more people to just have touch points with athletes across the days and weeks and months together, who are just as doing something as simple as just checking in. Brenda, how are you doing? And that might sound sort of like a very simple step, but someone to just sort of keep tabs on everybody and make sure that they're doing okay can be very meaningful. And he talked a lot about that. So the last time we spoke, you shared some what I thought was really good advice around how we talk to our kids. And when I say kids, I think I mean teenagers, college-age kids, about mental health. And you used this sort of seatbelt analogy that I loved. And I wonder if you can share that with us.
Sure. We want young people to be prepared for everything in life. We also want them to be prepared if there is, in case there is a mental health crisis, either for them or for someone that they care about. And a good friend of mine put it this way, that, look, no one puts on a seatbelt getting in their car, thinking that they're going to get in a car accident today, right? It's just not how it works. But car accidents happen. That's why we wear seatbelts. So we do it because it can save our lives if it does happen. And so looking at mental health crisis and knowing that it can happen already helps to change the game. And we can be in crisis. Someone can be in crisis and look okay. That's what's so challenging here is people can be working, they can be going to school, they can be going to class, right? They can be training and really be in a bad place. So it's also getting comfortable acknowledging as an athlete and as families to say, you just don't seem like you're yourself. You just don't seem okay. Let's talk about what are some options here. We all go through tough times mentally, all of us, but it's what we do from there that can save your life, right? So first thing is, if you're listening to this, please, we ask you to write down 2 phone numbers today and put them in your phone right after this podcast. They should be separate contacts, so they're easy to access. They're both free. They are confidential. They're staffed 24/7. The first number is the Crisis Lifeline, which is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. That phone number is 1-800-273-8255. The second number is the crisis text line, because sometimes, we all do a lot of texting, and sometimes for many reasons, people are more comfortable texting. The crisis text line is 741-741. Please put these two phone numbers into your phone, these contacts, so you have these tools for immediate help. If you're an adult, please share these with your student athlete. If you are a student athlete, share them with a friend, right? Good news is starting in July 16th of this year, of 2022, you'll be able to call or text 988 instead for Crisis Lifeline and Crisis Text Line. It will all be one number going forward. So in July, you'll be able to use 988. There will be a 2-year transition for those. So you can still use the phone number that I gave earlier for 2 years, but you can also use 988. And those go through for 2 years, the dual path, and then it kicks into 988 full-time in 2024. But one thing I just want to stress is it's important to know that these are completely confidential. If you call or text them, you are going to get help right away on the phone or by text, but it's going to be a compassionate person who's trained to help you. Police or EMS are not dispatched unless they need to be. You're not going to have, and there's not going to be a record about the call unless you need one to be. You don't get in trouble for calling this number. I remember growing up as a kid, I always, my parents always said, no, if you call 911 and you don't need it, that's a real problem. That's not what this is, right? It's here to help people. So we, the message is, if you're in doubt, but you feel like you need to call, that's the only reason you need, just call or text.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Thank you. And
yeah,
I think hopefully we'll go in a direction where people are just as likely to know that number as they do the 911 number, which is,
that's right.
Yeah. So it becomes, and there's still much less so now. We're definitely heading in the right direction, but there's still so much stigma attached to mental health challenges, right? And
yes.
Because it can be hidden the way you couldn't hide, if you were running a high fever or had a broken leg or some also awful injury, but
yes.
You can be, as you said, highly functional.
Right. And particularly for elite athletes, as we've talked about, whether, they're in the US team, but when you get into even college and college athletes, it's so important. The other note that I want to make about about the crisis lifeline, the suicide prevention hotline, is it's run by vibrant.org, Vibrant Emotional Health. And you can also get some great tips for managing your mental health, your emotional health on vibrant.org. It's a terrific website and they're doing great work. The other thing I just want to say about the crisis lifeline is if you know someone who is in a place where you think they could potentially hurt themselves, or you yourself feel vulnerable or feel boxed in, and you would feel more comfortable having someone that you know on that call with you, you can also do it as a 3-way. So you can, have your parent or a friend on with you and call them. And I think that's just important for people to know that it's really to be viewed as a resource.
Thank you for that too. In looking into this more, for this conversation with you, but also more broadly in thinking about what we as the governing body for the sport of rowing can do to help educate, bring resources, awareness to athletes of all ages, but especially juniors and collegiate athletes. I had multiple conversations with different people in the field, and I was able to speak with Meg Willett. She's a licensed mental health counselor from Harvard who works predominantly with student athletes. And in speaking with her, I asked her how the landscape has changed since COVID in her field. Some of the research points to a real epidemic of loneliness, and you touched on that a few minutes ago, in this country, that was compounded by COVID for young people. And I asked if she was seeing more challenges, and she wrote back to me and she said, yes, COVID has had a massive impact on everyone's mental health. The statistics show a significant increase in anxiety, depression, addiction, suicide ideation, eating disorders, and more. Adding these struggles to a student athlete who is already required to produce results both academically and athletically creates a much bigger challenge for them. It sounds like you already talked about how Brian's mental health challenges were compounded by COVID. And I wonder if you've heard this from other parents as well.
Absolutely. And one thing I will say also that I think is important to know is the medical examiner confirmed that there was no alcohol or drugs. There were no substances in Brian's system when he passed. And I think that's important because this is someone who was seemingly in such a good place, right? And he was just the last person who we would have thought would have ended his life. But absolutely, we've certainly heard it from other parents. And one thing, just back to the note about parents, I think, and about coaches, I'm going to say that again. When you were mentioning coaches and how coaches can help a student athlete's mental health, one thing is integrating parents, and we ask that we be included. A lot of athletes, many athletes that I've talked to have said that they did not and do not feel that if something was happening with them, that their parent contacting the coach, whether it's a club coach or a college coach, would be viewed favorably. In fact, they have said things like they would face retribution if a parent addressed what's going on. I've had a coach recently, a college coach, who told me that he welcomes, if a parent is in town and is nearby, he welcomes for them to even come on the launch. Mm-hmm. So I would say also, if coaches will allow parents to engage, ask us, invite us, tell us that you're open to that. Because I think parents are also looking for sort of on-ramps to how we can engage once these athletes are in college. It's a really, really difficult, challenging role because everybody has worked so hard to get the student athlete to this point, right? All the regattas, all the food, all the car trips, all the everything, and those joyful days, but it's a lot of work for everyone. And then all of a sudden, parents often feel like I show up, I don't even get to see them. I can't walk over, I can't talk to them. So I think starting to put those walls down and encourage more of a team approach. Mental health is a team sport. It really, really is. And it can be, supported by many different people.
Yeah, I like that mental health is a team sport. Very, very well said. Something else I wanted to share that I heard from Meg. I asked her what she wished all student athletes knew about mental health and well-being coming into college. And she said, and I'm quoting her here, she said, "I wish that athletes knew," and she said, especially at Harvard, that's where she is, that perfectionism is a self-defense mechanism to avoid judgment and shame. If people can realize that imperfection is nothing to be afraid of, and that by accepting their flawed self, they will be healthier, happier humans who will strive for excellence, developing self-compassion and understanding will allow students to enjoy their journey while continuing to achieve their goals. She also said this in terms of advice for parents and coaches, and this really struck me. She said, "We cannot expect our youth to be gentle and kind towards themselves if we are not that way toward ourselves. All of us deserve compassion and understanding, and that does not mean allowing excuses and unaccountability. We are often much harsher towards ourselves than we would ever be towards a friend or even a stranger. Why is that?" she asked. "If we can own our flaws with kindness publicly, it will give permission for our athletes to do the same." I thought that was really good insight coming from her to share. There's this mentality of perfectionism and performance. And I think it's really important to model, we are all by definition flawed and
Right.
as human beings. And so if we can sort of voice that and share that and, show some vulnerability as leaders, as parents, as coaches, and model that, I thought that really stood out for me. A goal of this podcast, as you know, is to help educate and inform other parents of rowers and rowers themselves. My next question for you is, as a parent, what do you want other parents to know?
I would say that you're not alone. Parents are not alone, and student athletes are not alone on this journey. I think that's job one, is to acknowledge that we all have this challenge of balancing, to your point, the pursuit of excellence while not sabotaging that with perfectionism. Knowing that their student athlete, their child does not have to walk this road alone, and that there are resources. I have been so grateful to get to know you and to get to know the team at US Rowing, and to begin to understand the kind of resources that are available with the governing body, like in the case of rowing with US Rowing and with Safe Sport, and to know that it doesn't stop with a college, right? There are lots of resources out there, and we need to get things on the table together to understand what's available and talk about it and use it.
Yeah. And I'm so moved, Brenda, by you and your bravery. And I remember in probably our second conversation, sort of just asking you how you had it in you after going through this tragedy to actually work to bring some light and positivity to our sport and to young people. And I was so moved by your response, because you talked about how you felt like Brian Jr. would have wanted you to bring something positive out of this tragedy. And I just, I think you're very brave. And I think the rowing world is lucky to have moms like you, women like you, who are strong enough to come here and tell this story, because I truly believe it will help other young athletes out there, whether it's this week or next month or in a year or 5 years, they will listen to this and realize that, in that moment of time, that was a dreadful moment of time, there is help out there and that they're not alone. And I imagine Brian Jr., lives on somehow through the work that you're doing. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and thank you for that.
Thank you so much. And we do, we feel his presence all the time. As I said, he was really such a passionate person about life. And we see that in his friends today. We're in touch with many of his high school and college teammates as well. And we're grateful for the opportunity because we truly believe that this is preventable.
Right.
And we know it's preventable.
It is.
But we have to remove the stigma of talking about mental health. It should be just like, to your point earlier, talking about, a broken bone or something else. We have to talk openly and often about it to get it out in the open and give people a comfort level, expressing when they're challenged or when they're in a bad place.
We've talked over the last several months about what U.S. rowing can do on this front, and I'm eager to hear a little bit more from you about this. And I feel a collective responsibility for student athletes. And what we can do as a governing body of the sport. We're not running clubs, we're not running collegiate programs, but we do have a voice and we do have resources we can share. We just brought on a new director of safety and well-being here, and we're looking into how do we integrate mental health first aid into coaching education. So it's really top of mind for us, and I wonder if you have other ideas for us as a national governing body of rowing.
Well, we're so grateful that you've brought on that director. I think it's such a positive step, and putting leadership into place who is focused on both physical health and mental health is certainly a step in the right direction. I also think awareness for athletes of what are the resources for when they need help. Right. So things like how we publicize the crisis lifeline, first of all, and as the transition is made into 988, what is that opportunity to get that phone number in front of kids and to get it into their phones, get it into their parents' phones, get it into their phones. I also think for families, athletes and families, to understand that the governing body is a resource when there are challenges with what's happening within their program, and knowing that they can contact U.S. Rowing. Mm-hmm. And I think helping to publicize and build awareness for athletes of, what exactly U.S. Rowing can do for them. I was so impressed when you told me, I think is 70,000 members. Mm-hmm. And many of them are club athletes and college athletes. And so U.S. Rowing is not just for the national team. It's not just for Olympians. And that was real learning for me. So I would say that it's probably learning for parents and athletes as well, to say that it's beyond just paying your membership fee, right? That to sort of check that box, but that there's resources there. And I think to understand what those are, and then when they get their letter each year, their membership card, what goes with that? Is there a hotline phone number that is that's on the card, right? And on the website, what to do when you're having challenges. So I think, building awareness is super important.
Yeah. And that is the goal. So, and that's, one of the reasons we're having this conversation, because I think we've both said to one another over the months that we've been talking, this is the beginning and we're just going to keep building on it. And, I'm really excited about that. And I think it's very positive. And again, I thank you for your time and your bravery. The last question I have for you is one that I ask everyone who comes on this podcast, and I'm going to ask you it for Brian Jr. And I already know, I think I know the answer, but for our listeners, so the question is always, you've been on a hard row. So Brian Jr.'s been out rowing. He's coming in after a very tough workout. What would be his go-to meal? What would he want to eat?
He was such a great eater and so much fun to eat with. He was a pretty adventurous eater, I will say. But he was also a very clean eater, especially after freshman year of high school. Now, he would eat a cheat meal, no problem, right?
No judgment.
No judgment. And he would let himself do that. But I will say this, he was very focused on a high protein diet. So when he was in recovery and coming off of a very hard workout or a hard race, he was all about recovery and going in for great protein. So he loved chicken. He loved chicken parm, roasted chicken. He really loved roasted vegetables. So like every Sunday, I mean, I was putting, and I'm sure I know so many parents relate to this, of 2 trays of huge cookie sheet of any roasted vegetables we could get our hands on. But he loved sweet potatoes, Brussels sprouts, asparagus. He loves spinach. And if it was morning, and so many races are in the morning, right? And if he was home, or sometimes even in the middle of the day, he loved to make himself omelets. He was a great cook. And he loved to make, a veggie omelet, and he might do chicken sausage in it, and cheese. And so loved that, loved home fries. We just had so many great times. He loved tacos. He was, so much fun to eat with and be with all the time. And those are a lot of great memories for us. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Wow. Well, maybe we will be able to enjoy one of those meals together sometime.
That sounds great.
Yeah, I would love that. And really just thank you again so much, and for sharing your story and his story and your family's story, and really contributing to what I think is the beginning of, U.S. rowing, really trying to share resources and be a resource on this very important topic. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I agree. We're all on this journey together, right? And treating each other with compassion, and with treating mental health with compassion is really the first step. And talking about it is also the first step. So I really, really appreciate you having the podcast, putting it out there, and continuing to put mental health for student athletes at the forefront.
Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Meg Willett, a licensed mental health counselor from Harvard University who works with student athletes. She has created multiple valuable tools to support students' mental health as they navigate the challenges of balancing athletics and academics. Hi, Meg. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Amanda.
Yeah, I know it's been a busy year for you at Harvard. So we were waiting for things to calm down a little bit, or relatively speaking, for you to join us on this really important topic. Can you tell us a little bit about, who you work with at Harvard, and, sort of the scope of your work there?
Yeah, for sure. So we work with all the student athletes, both on an individual basis, but also with teams and groups. We also work with the staff, so the athletic trainers and any of the staff who want consultation or support as well.
Great. All sports, or do you focus on certain sports?
All sports.
All of them.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Very busy.
Yeah. I'm sure that keeps you very busy. All right. Well, I'm just going to jump right in on this topic. One thing we think about a lot here at US Rowing is the role of the student athlete who's rowing in college. And wonder if you have an opinion on whether those students are at a higher or lower risk for mental health issues than their peers who are not student athletes.
Yeah, that's a tricky question because we don't know what's going on in other people's lives, right? So for non-student athletes, they can be up against more than a student athlete. So it's really an individual basis, I believe. But I think if we look just generally at the population, I think student athletes are at a higher risk because of the pressures that they have on them just by being an athlete in college. So if we think about the contributing factors to high stress and that influence suicide, the environments that they're in, genetics, situations, busy schedules, pressure to succeed, social media, with that being public, the performances, and then relationship difficulties, depending on the team culture and the social climate, those things can kind of create a perfect storm sometimes.
Yeah. And have you seen these challenges? Have they been compounded by COVID for student athletes? And if so, how?
Yeah, so COVID has had a massive impact on everyone's mental health. The statistics show a significant increase in anxiety, depression, addiction, suicide, eating disorders, and more. And so adding these struggles to a student athlete who's already required to produce results academically and athletically, creates a much bigger challenge for them.
Yeah. And I think you said it right. I mean, yeah, who hasn't, been affected by COVID in this country? So you're thinking about student athletes, they're juggling classes, they're coming out of COVID, hopefully coming back together as teams now. They're juggling multiple workouts a day, right? A lot of pressure to perform and to succeed. What advice do you have for college students, especially as they're just coming onto campus? How can they, prepare themselves for that, good mental health throughout their collegiate rowing careers?
I wish we could get in front of everyone to have this conversation. Really, I think it comes down to mentality about themselves and their self-talk and their attitude towards performance. So if athletes continue putting a lot of pressure on themselves to be perfect or the top of their class or the top of their team or really come in performing and not allow space for learning or flaws, it really does. I have noticed a really big impact negatively on their mental health.
Right. So just putting that pressure on themselves and.
Yeah. So a topic I find myself talking about a lot in individual sessions is perfectionism. Student athletes that are, rowing or, playing a sport at the Division I level, they're used to, being at the top and, it's not always going to be that way. And even if you are at the top, sometimes that can add more pressure too. So I think getting used to not being perfect and actually having that be a positive thing, and realizing, that perfectionism is a self-defense mechanism to avoid judgment and shame. So if we can realize that imperfection is nothing to be afraid of, and if they can accept themselves, that they'll be healthier and happier humans, and they can still strive for excellence, that self-compassion doesn't mean that we're complacent or not driven, right? It actually allows more room for extra growth.
Let's back up a little bit. Can you tell me more about, what does a typical day look like for you working with student athletes? Who are you meeting with? What are you talking about? I mean, obviously this, we don't want specifics, but what sort of issues or challenges, situations are you navigating with students? Tell us more about what it's like to be in your role.
Yeah, I love this work. The student athletes and the coaches and the staff are really wonderful to work with. We're all pretty like-minded, having a history in college athletics as well. we're seeing the demand is so high for individual counseling. So whether it's mental health or performance-based, there's 2 of us here at Harvard that are dedicated just to the athletes in the clinical program.
That doesn't seem like a lot. Like just 2 of you? How many student athletes are there?
I think there's about 1,200. Yeah, so it's really, athletes have been a population that's been underserved because they're usually the last ones to seek help, because it shows a sign of weakness or you're not being mentally tough. And so athletes are kind of trained to deal with stuff or toughen up on their own and not ask for help. But we're really kind of seeing a change and a shift in that culture, which is really exciting. And more and more people are reaching out. So it's also kind of the demand for the therapists is really, really high.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like, I think you guys I think Harvard needs to hire more people.
Yeah.
That's my plug.
I hope so.
My unsolicited plug.
Yeah.
So in meeting with students, what are you seeing on a day-to-day? What sort of challenges do you see, more so than others?
See a lot of anxiety, depression, some relationship difficulties. I think with COVID, the social norms or ways of dealing with conflict in interpersonal relationships is really challenging, and it's creating tough dynamics within teams. Also seeing a lot of captains who are kind of taking the responsibility for the team culture or, success and putting it on their shoulders. And that's really, quite a bit of burden and responsibility to take on, which we don't want them to, of course. But yeah, a lot of anxiety and depression mostly. Also a really big one is eating disorders. So with eating disorders, depending on the sport, it can make a big difference. Sports that have weigh-ins or sports that have little uniforms that people have to wear really, is making such a big impact in a negative way for people's mental health.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And how do you work to support, you mentioned the coaches and staff. I mean, do you work directly to support the coaches in supporting the athletes, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so right now we're holding monthly coaches convos, we call them. So it's a space for coaches to come and we provide some psychoeducation to them. And then, we have a dialogue where, there's so much knowledge and experience in that room, right? So like facilitating that conversation for coaches to share with each other. But a lot of times they'll share kind of the struggles that are going on within their team. And we'll kind of talk about different ways to address that and things that have worked and things that haven't worked. And then, of course, just individual consulting with coaches in regards to, if they have a player who's really struggling, or just kind of the team dynamic as a whole. Right.
I'm sure that's really helpful. And so for people who are listening who are maybe parents of athletes, coaches of athletes, the people who surround these athletes, what sort of advice do you have for them of, let's start with, how do you identify when somebody's struggling? And I think you're so spot on by saying, the tricky thing about athletes is they're so trained, right, to endure, and what makes them so strong and so successful in many ways actually can be a disservice, I would say, when it comes to, but you have to make sure you're taking care of yourself. So first, what advice do you have for those who are surrounding the athletes in terms of identifying, maybe, let's just start with that, how do you know maybe when someone's struggling? If you said in an earlier conversation we had, which really stood out to me, you said, people only tell you what they want you to know, or something along those lines, which I thought was, yes, that's an excellent point. So advice for the people surrounding the athletes.
Looking for any changes in pattern in terms of their behavior or their thoughts or feelings that they're expressing. I think that's usually a good cue. But sometimes, like I said, if they don't want you to know that they're struggling, they won't give you any signs. So I think really trying to support the athlete holistically, like making sure they're eating healthy, getting good rest, surrounded in positive environments. And I think also making sure you're not putting any expectation on them and making sure that you're not expecting them to be perfect or perform their best all the time.
Okay. All right. Because I mean, we keep reading about, right, in the news across different sports, these collegiate athletes who seem to have everything going for them. And, are great students and wonderful athletes and surrounded by their teammates, support. And then, the most tragic stories are those who die by suicide. Are these just situations where nobody sees this coming, and because these student athletes are keeping that all inside?
Yeah, that can be it. I mean, if we think about reality, right? Like I have a certain reality looking at you and being in an environment, right? But someone's internal experience and their own personal reality could be really different. And so I think one thing that we can really do in terms of being around student athletes is getting them to talk about their reality. What is their day-to-day like? What is their experience? It might be very different from what we think their experience is, because there's so much going on that we don't know about.
If you're a coach of, maybe it's a high school athlete or a collegiate athlete, and they, and maybe what we're seeing externally is matching what's happening internally, but you're saying there's situations clearly where there is not a match there. What sort of questions can coaches be asking?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think when there's, say, something really difficult happening in the world, right, or in our communities, is opening up dialogue to talk about those things and saying, how has this impacted you? How are you interpreting this information? Or, if it's, just kind of, if it is strictly about the sport and the performance, asking those same open-ended questions with like, what's the season been like? Or, is it what you expected? Are you getting what you want out of it? Or what are the obstacles that are in the way for you to kind of reach your goals and have the experience that you want?
So just getting the dialogue going, basically.
Yeah. And it's a lot of times it can be like pulling teeth, right? But by asking more specific questions that are still open-ended can be really helpful.
And do you give advice to athletes about their teammates in terms of being advocates or another set of eyes and ears for one another?
Yeah, for sure. So at Harvard, there's really great programs, student athlete wellness leaders on each team and, advisory councils. So, we want to try to create as many pockets of support as possible. So the coaching staff, the captains, the wellness leaders, the advisory council, the, sport performance and therapists and athletic trainers. So as many people as we can get to have touch points with students, the better. Right, because they also might, just feel safer opening up to someone with a certain personality or how they look than others. And so the more pockets or, safety nets we can create, the stronger the support.
That's smart. So what you've definitely, it's clear you enjoy this work and this job. And I'm just so curious. I mean, what's the hardest part for you, or, in this role?
Time, not having enough time and ability within our schedules to do all the things that we want to do. So, it's great that there's so much demand. We have, already have a bunch of coaches requesting workshops, for the fall to come and talk about, self-talk and controlling energy levels and managing pressure and communication, like so many really like valuable topics. But we also have the highest number of individual clients that want to meet too. And so I just wish we had more time and space within our schedules to do the work. I also think that's the same, probably the biggest challenge for the athletes too, right? Is we can give them all the tools, but if they're, they have morning and evening workouts and classes and studying and hopefully have some kind of social life as well, like where do they have time to kind of practice these skills, and how do they manage that? And that's been really tricky for them too. So
that's the hardest part. And you keep mentioning self-talk. Can you talk about that a little bit more? I mean, I'm assuming I know what that means. But tell us a little bit more. What does that look like?
Yeah, so that's the little voice in our head that we all have.
Do we all have that?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
checking.
So it's kind of how we talk to ourselves, and go about our days. So we really wanted to cultivate a helpful self-talk, and that's often referred to as positive self-talk, but sometimes it is helpful to just kind of be like, oh my gosh, get your stuff together, some days and get ourselves back on track. But, making sure that it's helpful and we're not putting ourselves down or blaming ourselves or having any of these cognitive distortions, which is like black or white thinking, catastrophizing, mental filtering. There's all kinds of those. So making sure that we are kind of building ourselves up. We have to live our whole life with ourselves. So why do a lot of times we bully ourselves? The kindest people, are sometimes the biggest bullies to themselves. And so how do we start to shift that relationship that we have with ourselves?
That's really helpful. I'm taking mental notes. No, that really is. I wonder, I'm jumping around a little bit here, but, I think for sure the sort of the stigma attached to mental health has definitely dissipated over the years, certainly since I was a student athlete. This wasn't even a topic. I mean, that was a long time ago, but you didn't talk about that. That wasn't a...
No, definitely not.
Right. No, it was not. You would never say, well, I'm struggling. I don't even know if I'd be able to have identified it then. So it seems like we're making progress on that front. And I guess my question for you, though, is, are we still struggling you're in a very specific pocket at Harvard. So maybe if you can think beyond Harvard, and talking to colleagues across the country, I imagine you talk to people from other colleges and universities. Are we still, as a society, facing stigma connected to mental health and talking about it and getting treatment for it?
Oh, for sure. It's like you're spot on. It has gotten a lot better, but definitely it's still like a big issue and obstacle for people accessing care. I think it's dependent on geographical location of schools and people, but also like different sports have different cultures around it, and gender and, family background.
Do you have any advice for people listening who are, this is sort of a new space for them?
Yeah, I just give it a try. I think it's so nice to have a space where you can talk about whatever you want in a judgment-free, like non-biased way. When it's great to have a support network and go talk to people, but if they know you personally or are involved in your family or your team or things like that, it's just natural for them to have a biased opinion. So going to someone that's not connected to anything can be really beneficial in those ways. And, therapy's evolved a lot, from the 50s and 60s and kind of that, like that mindset or picture that a lot of people have, we're active, we ask questions, we do activities, it is what you want it to be. A lot of therapists are very much client-led.
Oh, that's great. Okay. I think that's really helpful to hear too. I think my last question for you, Meg, is really around, any advice you have to young athletes who are listening now, who are rowers, especially in college, but in high school too, who feel like they're struggling with mental health. What if you could reach out to all of them at once and message anything, what would that be?
Just do what you can. So whether that's with training or talking or getting help, maybe if talking to a therapist is too much to think about or you have certain obstacles in the way, maybe try, there's so many like really good books out there and podcasts like this. And, just there's a lot of resources, that, people can access. So, thinking about what are you ready for? Maybe it's not therapy, but maybe it's reading a book. Or maybe I've noticed at Harvard when we go and do a team workshop on whatever topic, there's usually a really high increase in people seeking individual care after that. So, getting to know the people around you who are therapists or sport performance counselors and getting familiar with them.
Yeah, I think what's always stood out for me is that, it's so tragic to hear about these young lives, that these young people who leave this earth way too soon, and are struggling so much, and nobody knows. And so, and there's so much help out there, whether it's through medication or therapy or, any of the pieces that you're talking about. And so I think it's so tragic when young people especially, feel like there isn't a path forward for them that could feel better. So, I really, really appreciate you taking some time with us. And I thank Harvard too for letting you take some time with us and sharing some wisdom for our rowers who are listening to this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I just want to add too that, feelings are temporary and situations are temporary. And so, if we can weather the storm and do what we can, focusing on doing what we can, and we can get through things together. If we try to hold things and maintain an image or, put certain standards or expectations on ourselves, that's only going to make life harder, so, really kind of being self-compassionate and kind and understanding to ourselves first. And like you said, recognizing that there's a lot of people who do care and there are a lot of things that do help is, spot on.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I think US Rowing is doing some really wonderful things. Just even being willing to have this conversation is brave and important. And I hope that, other organizations follow your lead and do this. This is the first step, like we talked about, facilitating conversations, and the dialogue is vital in helping people.
Yeah. Well, it's to me and to us at US Rowing, it's all part of wellness, right? So whether it's an injured back or it's a mental health issue or issue around wellness, it sort of doesn't matter. It all needs to be addressed. I'd love for us to get to a place where we don't look at these things as completely unrelated. They all need treatment and they all need care. So we're working on messaging that at least. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I want to thank everyone for listening. US Rowing feels this topic is critical, and the first step is candid discussion about what is happening at our boathouses. As a reminder, if you or anyone you know is struggling with mental health, the number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255.